Well, thank you very much indeed. And can I first of all thank all of you? I can honestly think of better things to do on a nice sunny Friday evening in the summer, but it's very nice of you to come. I'm also absolutely thrilled to be in this church, the church that Fanny Burney was actually married in. Many of you will know the plaque on her about her wedding in this church. I think it's amazing to be talking about her actually in this church, and also in the presence of the memorial to the Locke family. I'll come on to them, but they played a very major part in Fanny's life when she lived and visited in this area. I've also got one or two confessions to make. Although my talk is, I think, what is it, Fanny Burney and Juniper Hall, or Fanny Burney and the local area, I will actually talk about Fanny a bit more widely. She had such an extraordinary career and such interesting experiences, and her diaries and her letters give us a unique insight into illustrious people in the 18th century. I shall spend some time on that, but never fear. I shall come to Dorking and this area in due course. I have another confession. I set out actually to write a biography of a French countess who also left for us astonishing memoirs. I was given a copy one day in Paris by a French friend. He dropped it on the desk in front of me and said, "I think this will interest you." So I waded through the memoirs of Adèle, la Comtesse de Boigne, and I thought I must write about her, because I found that in all the histories of that period that I read, no one ever referred to her, but there are astonishing anecdotes of the whole time, the French Revolution, the restoration of the monarchy, right up to the mid-19th century. But my publisher said, well, we think your book will go down better if you can find an English author or diarist to join with her. And I thought about it, and I first thought of another Fanny, Fanny Trollope, the indomitable mother of the great Anthony Trollope, who actually lived in Paris for some years. But my wife, who is very good at Englit, my wife Diana said, why don't you use Fanny Burney? And I really knew very little about her, but I then discovered, of course, not only had she a tremendous French connection, she married a Frenchman, lived in Paris, and so on, but she had this extraordinary connection with this part of the country, with Dorking and Micklem and Juniper and so on. So I thought, well, I'd better try and write a book about them both, and that's what I did. And I'm not a professional historian, but I got absolutely obsessed by the story of Fanny and Adèle de Boigne. So let me move on to Fanny. I will divide her life into really three sort of periods. Her early life and her experiences in London, then the time that she worked at the royal court as second lady of the robes to Queen Charlotte, and then, and I do promise I'll come to it, her connection with Micklem and this area. But her early life, as portrayed in her diaries and her memoirs, she was a great scribbler. As a child, she was well known for scribbling. She lived at home. She never had schooling in any orthodox way. She was what we call an autodidact. But she, as a child, she was brought up in King's Lynn, where her father was a musician. He was the organist at the King's Lynn Church, and he, over time, became a very eminent expert on music, a musicologist. And I think a major book he wrote on music in Europe is still used today. Anyway, Fanny was brought up as a child in King's Lynn and well known in the family for scribbling all the time. And they moved to London and they lived in various houses, including a house that Isaac Newton lived in, which had an observatory on top. I think it's the place now in Westminster where the Westminster Library is. But Fanny had the use of a little studio where Newton presumably gazed at the stars, and she scribbled away up there. At one stage in her teens, she had a crisis and decided to destroy everything she'd written. She had a bonfire and destroyed everything, but luckily she carried on. Anyway, living in a household where her father became a very fashionable music teacher, he taught the children of many eminent intellectuals and artists and writers and so on. So Fanny at home got exposed to the company of many illustrious people. And as she grew up and moved to write her first novel, Evelina, which was published in 1778, published anonymously, no name on it then, because it really wasn't right that young girls should go around writing novels in those days in a well-brought-up family. But Evelina brought her tremendous, it was a sort of Booker Prize winner, and she became a celebrity. And there is sorry, I must, when I can find my gadget, there is our wonderful, come on. Yeah, there is, I think, this wonderful picture with that extraordinary hat. I mean, Fanny was very small. She was what, 5'3", 4", something like that. So she needed a very large hat to be able to compete with people. She published anonymously, although the word got out later that it was this extraordinary Fanny Burney, published the book Evelina, which was a great success. And she was taken up by an extraordinary lady called Hester Thrale, Thrale. And Hester Thrale actually was even shorter than Fanny, so the sort of 5'4" Fanny towered over Mrs. Thrale. But Mrs. Thrale, Hester Thrale, was married to a rich brewer called Henry Thrale, who had a large and profitable brewery in Southwark. And actually, I was very excited a few years ago going on a bus in Southwark. I saw a street called Thrale Street, so the memory still lasts. Anyway, Hester Thrale gathered together way out in the countryside at Streatham Park, a sort of salon, imitating the great French salons in Paris, and gathered together there a group of artists, intellectuals, and so on. And Fanny, the young, brilliant novelist, was invited very often to join this group of people. So we had, there's her father, Charles Burney, in later life, a very, very distinguished musicologist. And to the house in Streatham, where Fanny would often stay, were people like, there's Mrs. Piozzi, Mrs. Thrale. Later on, and I perhaps mentioned that later, she let everyone down by marrying an Italian music teacher when her husband, Henry Thrale, died. And people like Fanny and Samuel Johnson took a very dim view of marrying an Italian music teacher. So she became known as Mrs. Piozzi. But at her house, you had the great Dr. Johnson. I'll say more about him in a moment. You had Joshua Reynolds, the first president of the Royal Academy and one of our greatest portrait painters, and the wonderful David Garrick, who ran what was the theatre in London?
Drury Lane.
Thank you very much, Diana. Drury Lane Theatre. And Fanny records in one of her letters or diaries, she was absolutely terrified when he played the part of Richard II. But he was actually at school in Lichfield, where Samuel Johnson was brought up. In fact, Samuel Johnson taught him, and they both came to London and made their careers there. I'll move on to Queen Charlotte in a moment. So from Fanny, we get an extraordinary picture of these great celebrities. They were the celebrities of the day. And in a sense, the most interesting is Samuel Johnson, the great Dr. Johnson. And there are some wonderful descriptions in Fanny's letters and diaries of Dr. Johnson. Perhaps I can just quote one. She was at a dinner at this house in Streatham, way out in the countryside, and Dr. Johnson appeared, and she said, "He is indeed very ill-favoured. He's tall and stout, but stoops terribly. He's almost bent in double. His mouth is almost constantly opening and shutting, as if he were chewing. He has a strange method of frequently twirling his fingers and twisting his hands. His body is in constant agitation, seesawing up and down. His feet are never for a moment quiet, and in short, his whole person is in perpetual motion." That is the great Dr. Johnson. And I reread recently, or I waded through Boswell's Life of Johnson. I don't suggest you take it on holiday. It's about 1,200 pages of small type, but it's absolutely fascinating. And Boswell said of Johnson, "His figure was large and well-formed, yet his appearance was rendered strange and somewhat uncouth by convulsive cramps. He never knew the natural joy of a free and vigorous use of his limbs. When he walked, it was like the struggling gait of someone in fetters. When he rode, he had no command or direction of his horse, but he was carried as if in a balloon." Well, that is the great Samuel Johnson, the great wit, the great intellectual, the man who almost single-handed wrote the English dictionary, for which he was paid the miserable sum of about £1,500, which may sound a lot in present money, but it really wasn't much for 3 years' work, which he did almost entirely himself. But Johnson was very, very fond of Fanny Burney. He admired enormously her first novel, Evelina, which, as I say, was published anonymously. In fact, there was a curious way in which it was finally brought to the market. At one stage, one of her brothers took the manuscript round to the publisher in disguise so that no one would know that it had been written by Fanny. And Fanny was very nervous. As I said, it wasn't really the thing for young women to write novels in those days. And she was worried that her father would not approve. And so he knew nothing about it. I mean, she sat scribbling and scribbling, and her father didn't even know she was writing what is a pretty long epistolary novel. But actually, when it was published and was a success, her father was very generous in his praise, and that was a great relief to Fanny. She followed the novel Evelina with, in 1782, with her second novel called Cecilia, which I still find difficult, but not quite so difficult as Evelina. And it's interesting, Jane Austen was a great fan. of Fanny. And you will find in the closing chapter of Cecilia highlighted the words Pride and Prejudice. So I'm sure we have experts here who will know better than I to what extent Jane Austen was influenced, but the connection seems very strong. No Surrey so far, but I do promise I'll move on to Surrey in due course. Actually, the only Surrey connection was that the Burneys had a family friend, a sort of uncle called Daddy Crisp, who was a bachelor, who was versed in the arts and literature and so on. And he and Fanny had a regular correspondence. And he lived in Surrey. He lived in a house at Chessington. And I've never been able to find it. A description I read was that he lived at Chessington Hall on a large, lonely, desolate common, no regular road, or even a track from Epsom. You need a guide to reach it. Well, goodness knows where he lived, but there was a Surrey influence there, you see. Now we move on to what I think is the second phase of Fanny's life. As part of being introduced to various people, she found herself invited to the house of an elderly lady called Mrs. Delaney, who lived in a Grace and Favour house at Windsor, next to the Windsor Castle. And she was a friend and patronized by the George III and Queen Charlotte. And Fanny was invited there. And one day, when she was at a little gathering, you know, the door opened and a large man came inside saying, what? And hello, Miss Burney, what are you up to? What? And it was the King, George III. And Fanny again describes in her letters and memoirs her first meeting with this extraordinary monarch. And soon after that, she was invited to join the royal household as second lady of the robes to Queen Charlotte. She was very reluctant indeed there we are, Queen Charlotte. She was very reluctant to take this on. It wasn't her scene at all. But she was rather worried that she was under pressure, I think, from her father. I mean, he had aspirations to become master of the King's music, and he thought that getting Fanny in at the court would help his prospects. One of her brothers was also a naval officer, and again, he thought that if Fanny was in with the royal family, his chances of promotion to be an admiral were increased. So she agreed to go, and she spent, I think, 5 years or so, or from 1785 to 1791, as second lady of the robes to Queen Charlotte. And I think we've got a nice picture. There's the King, King George. And there, I think, a lovely picture of the royal family. And she had a very difficult time indeed. The first lady of the robes was a very strict German or Austrian lady called Mrs. Schwarzenberg, who ruled Fanny's life very, very strictly indeed. And Fanny was on duty for very, very, very long hours with very strict protocol and so on. And she was very unwell during that time. It was almost as if she was in prison. But again, in her letters and her diaries, she's left us an extraordinary account of life at court, including the transition of George III to what is called madness. Some of you will recall the Alan Bennett the film with Alan Bennett of The Madness of King George. It was, I think, conventional to call it porphyria, a sort of blood disease, but I think most doctors and medical people are agreed now that it was not that at all, but he suffered from a bipolar form of schizophrenia. Anyway, you will find in Fanny's letters and diaries a description of the king descending into, we'll call it madness, and his behavior and the alarm of the queen and so on. And I have I think he was a lovely man, I think, King George III. And one of Fanny's accounts, which I think is a lovely one, is an occurrence at Kew. The king was shut up in Kew Palace. I don't know whether you've ever been there in Kew Gardens. Fanny went with the royal household and lived in one of those little garret rooms up in Kew Palace. And one day she was told that it was okay for her to go for a walk in the woods at Kew because the king was safely, locked up or strapped up or whatever. And so Fanny went off, and as she was walking, she heard noises and conversation. And finally, she heard somebody shouting, "Miss Burney, Miss Burney, why are you running away?" And she was terrified, and she ran. But the person chasing her caught up. And if I may quote from her diary, Fanny said, "The king, he put both his hands round my shoulders and kissed my cheek and said, 'Miss Burney, why did you run away? I will be your friend as long as I live. I here pledge myself to be your friend.' He then opened his whole heart to me and sang several Handel choruses." The king was absolutely enchanted with Handel, but he was so dreadfully hoarse that the sound was terrible. I think that's an extremely moving description of the king and her encounter with him. Anyway, Fanny was fairly desperate to get her release from court. The regime there was so strict. And again, may I read to you another extract from her diaries, which, being in a church, I don't often speak in churches, but it's perhaps the sort of behavior that we ought to observe here today in this church. Fanny is talking about how she was obliged to behave when she was on duty at court. She said, "In the first place, you must not cough. If you find a cough tickling in your throat, you must arrest it from making any sound. If you find yourself shaking with the forbearance, you must choke but not cough. In the second place, you must not sneeze. If you have a vehement cold, you must take no notice of it. If your nose membranes feel a great irritation, you must hold your breath. If a sneeze still insists upon making its way, you must oppose it by keeping your teeth grinding together. If the force of this grinding breaks some blood vessel, you must break the blood vessel, but you mustn't sneeze. And then in the third place, you must not, upon any account, stir hand or foot. If, for a chance, a pin runs into your head from your headgear, be sure to bear it without wincing. If it brings the tears into your eyes, you must not wipe them. If the blood should gush from your head by means of the black pin, you must let it gush. If, however, the agony is very great, you may privately bite the inside of your cheek or of your lips for a little relief, taking care, meanwhile, to do it so cautiously as to make no apparent sign outwardly. And with that precaution, even if you even gnaw a piece of your cheek, it will not be minded, only be sure to swallow it, or remit it to a corner of your mouth till everyone is gone. You must not spit. Anyway, I sometimes think that's the rule that when I was a choir boy many years ago, before I was expelled for allegedly making a noise during a sermon, I think that was the behavior we were supposed to observe. Anyway, Fanny had a very tough time indeed, and she was desperate to get out of her job in the court. And finally, in 1791, she was allowed to leave with great regret on the part of Queen Charlotte, and she was given a pension of £100 a year, which may not sound much, but was probably double the amount a young curate would get in those days. So she was assured of an income. Now at last, we move to, and Juniper. Fanny had a sister called Susanna, her favorite sister, and she was married to a Captain Molesworth Phillips, who was a Marine captain and had been a great hero. He was with Captain Cook when Captain Cook was murdered in his last voyage. And they lived in Mickleham, and some of you will know better than I where they actually lived. I read that they were in a house called Mickleham Cottage, opposite the old house. Now, I don't know where that is, but it was demolished in 1930. Anyway, Susanna lived in Mickleham, and Fanny visited her from time to time. And in September 1792, Susanna wrote to Fanny about some French visitors who had rented Juniper Hall. And among those visitors they were fleeing the French Revolution. Their property had been expropriated. They were in danger of losing their heads, literally. And a group of them, with the help of the great Madame Germaine de Stael, the great French intellectual and opponent of Napoleon, she helped to smuggle some of them out of Paris, even though she was locked up for a time and nearly went to the guillotine. But the main group of French aristocrats, who were called constitutionalists, that is, they favored the principles of the French Revolution, which fundamentally were to replace the autocratic French monarchy with a constitutional monarchy, as in England. But they were opposed, of course, to the methods, the slaughter, the guillotine, the murder, and so on. But the group comprised, or the main people were Germaine de Stael, this great intellectual, who was the daughter of somebody called Monsieur Necker, who had been the finance minister of Louis XVI. And Germaine de Stael was actually married to the Swedish ambassador in Paris, which gave her diplomatic immunity. And that's how she was able to help smuggle some of her mates out of Paris. And with her came her lover, Count Louis de Nar. She had many lovers in her time, although she was really quite ugly, I think. She had many lovers, but she was accompanied by Count Louis de Narbonne, who was an ex-war minister. And according to Fanny and other sources, the good people here of Mickleham were very shocked by this immoral relationship. Now, whether they would be shocked by it nowadays, you can tell me, but it was a bit of a scandal. There was also Count de Lally Tollendal, Princess Hénin, and the giant of the group, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, of whom I'm sure many of you will have heard. He was the great survivor, the great statesman. He'd been foreign minister, prime minister, ambassador here and there, and Napoleon didn't think very much of him and much regretted he hadn't had him shot when he had an opportunity. And Napoleon once described him, and I'm not sure whether I'm allowed to say this in this building, he described him as, and forgive my French, un tas de merde dans un bas de soie, which again, being translated, is a lump of ordure in a silk stocking. Anyway, Talleyrand was in this group, and I have to say, just as I am thrilled and overawed to be in this church where Fanny was married, when I go to Juniper Hall, and over the years our children attended courses there, to think that 240 years or so ago, the great Talleyrand was actually dining in the Templeton room. I think I find that overawing. Anyway, he was part of the group, and Fanny got a letter from her sister saying, "You must come along here. There's," and I quote, "a little colony of unfortunate noblesse in our neighborhood." So Fanny was introduced to them, and they had a jolly time. She stayed with her sister, and they went and they dined together and went on picnics from Juniper Hall. And just see, oh, there is a Juniper Hall in the 18th century. And I don't know, perhaps other experts will know better than I. I think one of those people on the front must be Talleyrand. But which one, I'm not sure. Anyway, with them also was a French general called Alexandre d'Arblay. And Susanna, who's all for matchmaking, wrote to Fanny and said, you know, there is this general, he's tall, good figure, open and manly countenance, he's about 40. And Fanny met him, and she was very impressed, and they got together, and she didn't have much French. She'd never really been taught French properly, and his English was a bit rudimentary, so they taught each other English and French, and Fanny fell in love with him. And he proposed to her. Fanny's father was rather concerned, because he was a bit worried that if Fanny got hitched up to a French asylum seeker, as it were, she might lose her pension from Queen Charlotte. But nevertheless, they got married, and they were married here in this church, which makes it so exciting to be speaking in the same place. Her father didn't attend the wedding, but he was reconciled to it later. And at the wedding were Captain Molesworth Phillips and Sister Susanna and William and Frederica Locke, who feature on the great memorial plaque in this church. And they were tremendous friends and supporters. When Fanny was in effect imprisoned at Windsor and in the court, Frederica often wrote to her, and I think was helped preserve her sanity there. And they attended the wedding. They honeymoon, and I say her father came round to the marriage later. They spent their honeymoon at Phoenix Farm at the top of Bagdon Hill, if that means anything to locals. I'm afraid I don't. They then moved to a house called the Hermitage or Hermitage in Great Bookham. And then in 1796, they were given a 5-acre plot on the Norbury estate in a field north of Chapel Lane, bounded on the east by Crabtree Lane. I hope this makes sense to some people. And on the north by Chapel Farm. And General D'Arblay, who he'd been the chief of staff to the great Lafayette, so he was a man of some military standing. He actually designed the cottage that there we are. Here's your upright, handsome chap. And he, here's the church, which you know so well where we are. And they built a cottage which they call Camilla Cottage, because meanwhile Fanny had published another novel called Camilla, which sold very well and made a bit of money. And with the process, General D'Arblay designed this fairly simple cottage, and they lived there for about four years. And the great general got jolly keen on gardening. And there are some wonderful descriptions of him, even one where he's got his military saber and he's cutting the hedges by going round slashing with his saber. But it all came to grief at one time because all the pigs and cows and sheep got out from Chapel Farm and trampled all over his vegetables. But one thing he was enormously proud of was his cabbages. Now, cabbages, I think, had some very special significance in those days. Maybe in times of shortage of food, cabbage was a very crucial commodity. People could grow cabbages. And one day, a few years ago, I was snooping around Juniper Hall, and I went up the staircase, and I saw, some of you, I'm sure, will know it. It's not a stained glass window, but there is a stained glass panel stuck up the staircase. And when I saw that, nobody there seemed to know anything about it, and there was no inscription. And as soon as I saw it, I thought, that must be General D'Arblay handing over a cabbage to Fanny Burney. Now, whether it is or not, or whether the artist meant that, but for me, that is it, handing over the cabbage. Incidentally, one of the cottage was built on the money that Fanny earned from the publication of another novel, Camilla, hence called Camilla Cottage. And this time, rather than negotiating a fee from the publisher, it was funded by subscription. Before you published it, you got lots of people to guarantee to buy so many copies at so many guineas and so on. And one of the subscriptions was taken out by J. Austen, who, as I said, was a huge admirer of Fanny and her work. Well, they lived for 4 years or so, cutting hedges and growing cabbages and all that. And in 1802, I'm afraid we'll now move away from Surrey, the Peace of Amiens was struck between England, it wasn't Britain or the UK in those days, it's always England, and France. So General D'Arblay decided to return to France to try and retrieve his family fortune. And so they both went over and lived in Paris. He, in fact, got a rather modest civil service job in Paris, in one of the ministries. They then got locked in because the peace broke down very quickly. Both the English and the French failed to deliver all they'd agreed to do in the peace, the Treaty of Amiens. And so effectively war was declared again. And people like Fanny and her husband were really sort of aliens. They weren't imprisoned as we imprisoned people in the Second World War, aliens, but they weren't allowed to leave France. And so we get a different set of descriptions from Fanny in her diaries. I mean, we get accounts of seeing Napoleon on parade on the Champ de Mars. She was a great admirer of Napoleon then. She also had a privileged visit to the studio of the great French portrait painter David, and some of the great pictures of Napoleon. I think I probably have one here. Oh, no, there's a sketch of Camilla Cottage. Sorry, they feature in Fanny's memoirs, but not immediately relevant. But there we are, the great phony picture of Napoleon on horseback crossing the Alps. But Fanny went to the studio of David to meet Mrs. David, and she saw this picture being painted. So we have a very interesting account. But I think many things to be said about their time in Paris, but I think the most horrific, which again some of you will know, is that in 1811, after they'd been there a number of years, Fanny was diagnosed with breast cancer. And they summoned a man called Larrey, L-A-R-R-E-Y, who'd been Napoleon's principal military surgeon. I mean, he was on duty at all the great battles at Waterloo and everywhere. He reckoned to have lopped more arms and legs off than anyone living. To cut the story short, in their little house in Paris, she underwent a mastectomy without anesthetic, which is really, I mean, just unbelievable. And she, in her, I don't know whether it was a letter or part of her diary, she has a long description of this operation down upstairs on a bed in their house. I mean, utterly horrific. But she was incredibly tough, and she survived it. She lived till she was about 88, I think. And I suspect that she didn't have breast cancer. But nevertheless, she agreed to go undergo this horrific operation with no anesthetic. I think she was given a glass of wine cordial, according to her letter, and that was it. In 1812, they returned to England, and then lived in I think, Bath and London, not back in Surrey, I'm afraid. But they then went back to Paris after Napoleon had been defeated at the Battle of Leipzig and sent to Elba. He was made president of the island. He wasn't a prisoner, but he was effectively exiled to Elba. So they went back to Paris, thinking it was safe, Napoleon out of the way, Louis XVIII had been restored. But then, of course, Napoleon escaped from Elba and came back and marched up through France and took over again for the 100 days, ending in the Battle of Waterloo. And Fanny's diaries give us she fled with many others from Paris, fled to Brussels, where Wellington and the Allied Army were grouping. And you get an absolutely brilliant account of the atmosphere in Brussels on the eve of the Battle of Waterloo, and the panic when the first casualties came back and they thought Napoleon had won, and so on. The account there, I think, is hugely valuable in giving one another picture of what went on in Brussels at the time of the Waterloo campaign. And there's my hero, the Duke of Wellington, who won the battle. After the battle, General D'Arblay had actually gone off to a place called Trier in Germany on behalf of the French royalists to try and raise troops to help the Allies fight against Napoleon. And he wasn't actually at Waterloo. But he was badly injured, ironically, and I think it must be a letdown, because if you're a soldier, you'd rather get a bullet or a sword thrust. He was kicked by a horse, and which he was in rather a bad way. And the indomitable Fanny set off from Brussels on her own to find her husband, going through occupied territory with roving bands of soldiers and so on. Anyway, she finally found him, and they came back to England in 1815, and they lived mainly in London until D'Arblay died in 1818, but Fanny lived on till 1840, so she was 88 when she died. So it was an astonishing, I think that's the last of my, yes, it is. I think it was an astonishing life, starting from this little child in King's Lynn, the scribbler who became a successful novelist, served in the court at Windsor and elsewhere, had her adventures with the French here in Juniper Hall and Surrey, and then long years in France, living under Napoleon, the restored monarchy, and so on. So, but without the Juniper Surrey, it wouldn't be quite so interesting, would it? Anyway, I think I've talked long enough, and I must stop. I wouldn't like. I'm ambivalent on Dr. Johnson. I sometimes think he really was a rather pompous so-and-so, who Boswell said of Johnson, conversation with him was simply a contest, and he didn't like losing. But Johnson moving a vote of thanks on one occasion to a speaker who, perhaps like me, has gone on a bit too long, he said, what a wonderful talk, absolutely fascinating. He said, come and talk to us again some other time when you have less time to spare. So thank you very much for listening. I mean, if anyone did have a question or comment or wants to put me straight or fill in some of the gaps, do please feel free. Oh, goodness. When it's family, you know it's going to be difficult.
I just wondered, did Fanny and D'Arblay have children?
They did. They had one son, Alexander, who was a very bright young man who went into the church, but had a very disappointing career and died at a relatively early age. I can't remember how old, but he probably was not yet 40. So it was a huge sadness to them that he didn't, as it were, do better. But she didn't have the child until she was over 40. I mean, she didn't get married till she was 40-odd. So to have a child over 40 then was, you know, not without its dangers.
I wondered about the cabbage and that lovely little stained glass piece. But cabbage in French is chou. Mon petit chou is a term of endearment.
Of course,
actually, he's
of course.
giving her, you know,
Maybe.
It's a metaphor for giving her his love.
Could be. We had a French, not a French, a Scottish-Italian professor who visited here, an expert on Fanny Burney, some months ago. Ben will recall. And she gave a talk over at Leatherhead Library, and she seemed rather obsessed by cabbages. and I showed her this, which she didn't know about.
Oh, well.
And she was absolutely thrilled to bits to find this cabbage scene. So you may well be right. I hadn't thought of that.
We live in Camilla Drive,
Ah,
which is named
yeah,
after
indeed.
Camilla
Yes.
novel. When they were in Brussels, is it known whether Fanny attended the Duchess of Richmond's ball on the eve of the Battle of Waterloo?
No, she didn't. No. And perhaps I meant to say also that Camilla Cottage was, when they returned to Britain, they found that the Locks, who had given them the land, there was some mix-up, I don't know exactly, but the son, William Locke, decided that they didn't actually have title to the land and they were made to sell it. And I think sold it to loss. And Camilla Cottage was later expanded, became Camilla Lacey. Again, many people here will know it. And I think it was destroyed by fire in 1919. So alas, there are references on Camilla Drive and so on, but I'm afraid the cottage is no longer there.
Can I just ask about her name? Because we tend to know her as Fanny Burney. Did she refer to herself as Madame D'Arblay most of the time?
Yes, she didn't. Yes, she was known as Madame D'Arblay, but also she, when she died, she used the title Countess, and she was La Comtesse Veuve Piochot d'Arblay. I think that was in her will. So, and my information is that's the only time she actually used the title of Countess.
She's buried above, and I can't remember whether the tombstone says Fanny Burney or Madame D'Arblay.
Right. I mean, for those who are dying to know more, there is a book called A Tale in Two Cities, which is, in a sense, a joint biography of Fanny Burney and Adèle la Comtesse de Boigne, the one I initially was moved to write about. And much of what I've said this evening is covered in the book, of course.
I just want to say an enormous thank you to Sir Brian, because that was absolutely riveting and fun and moving, and it was everything you really want a good evening to be, wasn't it? I do think that those descriptions of her life at court are just something else that you couldn't imagine.
Yes.
Biting the inside of your cheek until the blood ran, or even perhaps you chewed a piece off, but you weren't allowed to do anything more than swallow it. Incredible. Thank you so much for opening windows and showing us a whole side of Fanny Burney that I've never really properly appreciated. And please will we give him a big round of applause.
Thank you very much. Well, again, thank you all very much for coming.